In November of 1989, Betty Broderick drove to her ex-husband's house in the dead of night. He was asleep in his bed with his new wife. Betty crept inside and, in a fit of rage, put several bullets into Dan Broderick and Linda Kolkena, killing them both. Hi, I'm Denise from Fascinating Cases. The case of Betty Broderick has long fascinated me. She was known as a woman scorned. Some considered her a cold-blooded killer. Others sympathized with Betty, saying Dan Broderick brought this all on himself by driving Betty completely and systematically crazy. The story of Dan and Betty is a tragic one. It all began in 1965 at a Notre Dame football game. Betty was tall and beautiful and smart, and Dan was a pre-med student. He saw Betty and approached her with a note. It said MDA, medical doctor almost. Betty thought Dan was a bit on the geeky side, but he pursued her heavily, and she eventually agreed to marry him in 1969. But Betty said Dan changed almost immediately after the wedding. He was cold and distant even on their honeymoon. There was no affection. Dan sat by the pool alone and read, ignoring Betty completely. Dan supposedly told friends only a few short weeks after the wedding that marrying Betty was a mistake and there was something wrong with Betty. But they dated for years before getting married. Didn't he get to know Betty pretty well? He did put a ring on it. And it was a new lifestyle for Betty too. She was used to coming and going as she pleased and spending money where she wanted. But right away, she said it was clear Dan Broderick was in charge. Dan graduated from medical school, but decided that wasn't enough. He wanted to go to law school too. So he and Betty moved to Massachusetts so Dan could attend Harvard University. Betty worked hard to help with Dan's schooling. She was a hostess, a teacher, a daycare provider, making all the money she could to pay for Dan's tuition. Soon, Betty and Dan started a family. They had back-to-back daughters. Kim was born in 1970 and Lee in 1971. Betty complained that Dan was never home and never spent any time with her or the kids. She said she was basically raising the kids on her own. In 1973, Dan moved his family to San Diego. He was trying to establish himself as a malpractice attorney. And while money was still tight, Betty kept working, earning what she could, besides being a mother. Soon, 2 boys were born to the Brodericks, Danny in 1976 and Rhett in 1979. Around 1981, money started rolling in, and the Brodericks were soon rich. It seemed all of Dan's hard work paid off. But he couldn't have done it without Betty, who supported him for years and worked her tail off as well. Dan's practice became successful, and Betty spent her time raising the kids and enjoying the socialite life. But cracks started to form in the marriage. Actually, cracks were always there. They just got worse. Dan worked all hours and was never home, which frustrated Betty greatly. She was constantly asking him to spend more time with her and the kids. They even went to a marriage retreat to make things work, and Dan promised that as soon as he made enough money and was successful enough, things would change. But that didn't happen. Dan became really successful, but he didn't change his ways. Betty said she felt like a single parent. And when they were together, Betty and Dan argued. Things took a drastic turn in 1983. Dan and Betty were attending a party, and Dan spotted a woman across the room. Dan said to a colleague, "Wow, she is beautiful. Who is that woman?" It was a 20-something Linda Kolkena, a receptionist in Dan's office building. Betty overheard Dan say this, and she said it was like a stab in the heart. Dan Broderick didn't talk like that. He didn't talk about other women or pursue other women. But something about this Betty knew was different, and alarm bells went off in her head. Betty was going to keep an eye on this situation, and sure enough, soon Dan came home saying he hired a new assistant. He needed one. It would help lighten his load. He told Betty this is a good thing, right? I can be home more, he said. Sure, Betty thought, it's a good thing. Until she found out who the new assistant was. It was none other than Linda Kolkena, who Betty said could not even type. Those alarm bells in Betty's head, now they were clanging. Betty questioned Dan about hiring Linda. She was openly very worried about the situation. Dan said Linda was the right choice, and it was strictly professional. At one point, Betty insisted that Dan get rid of Linda, but Dan flat out refused. And soon, Dan grew even more distant and more irritable than ever. He called his home, according to Betty, tacky, and his family was tacky. And he said Betty was old, fat, ugly, and stupid. Can you imagine? Ouch.
I didn't care about anybody else's opinion of me. I really cared about his. He really had me believing that I was just the most wasted, ugly piece of crap.
Betty was still relatively young, too, in her mid-30s. But still, that was 15 years older than Linda. So what did Betty do? She lost weight. She grew her hair long and contacted a surgeon about removing wrinkles that weren't even there yet. It didn't seem to matter. Dan was still distant. So Betty took some drastic measures. There were some pills laying around the house and a razor in the bathroom. In a moment of desperation, Betty hurt herself. Dan came home, found Betty, and fixed her up. He told her she was acting crazy over nothing. There was nothing going on with Linda, no affair. Dan denied the affair for years, gaslighting Betty. The term gaslight comes from an old 1944 movie with a husband who was doing things to drive the lady of the house insane. To gaslight means to manipulate someone using psychological methods into questioning their own sanity and power of reasoning. Dan Broderick was gaslighting Betty and psychologically abusing her as well by denying the affair and calling her off her rocker. Betty wanted to save her marriage so bad, so she followed a friend's advice one day. It was Dan's 39th birthday, and her friend said, "Go down to Dan's office, be a presence there in front of Linda." So Betty dolled up and brought some champagne and was going to take Dan out to a nice dinner. When Betty arrived at the office building, a receptionist said Dan was not in, saying they're gone. "Who's gone?" Betty asked. Dan and Linda. They went out to lunch, and they weren't back yet. Betty, on alert, said I'll wait in his office, but she found something that must have hit her like a ton of bricks. In Dan's office were balloons, half-eaten cake, and champagne. It seemed somebody already had a birthday party for Dan, and that somebody was most likely Linda. Betty waited for a bit, and then she went home. She waited some more, and finally, Dan came home after 7 hours. But he arrived to all his clothes in a big pile in the front yard. And when Dan asked about it, Betty lit the pile on fire. Poof! She thought Dan would be enraged. But he calmly took Betty into the house and sat her down and said, "I'm not having an affair." He said he was at a deposition. Many people were there, including Linda. Betty believed him and ordered him a whole new wardrobe the next day. Betty and Dan were still being intimate, but Betty said Dan changed. He learned some new tricks. And one time when Dan came home late and crawled into bed with Betty, she could still smell Linda on him. He seemed to enjoy it too, taunting Betty in a way. But finally, in 1985, Dan came home to Betty and said he needed space. He planned to move out for a while. He didn't mention divorce and continued to deny the affair. But he packed some things and moved out, devastating Betty. She still had hope, but Betty was getting angry. She was being the single mother she always was, spending all her time with the kids. So she thought she would teach Dan Broderick a lesson. Each time one of the kids would act up and talk back, Betty would put them in the car and drop them off at Dan's doorstep, one by one, believing Dan would wake up and see how hard Betty worked. But it backfired completely. Dan kept the kids. Finally, after years of denying the affair, Dan admitted he was seeing Linda and he wanted a divorce. Betty was right all along. She was snapping. All she wanted in life was to be Mrs. Dan Broderick and be the mother of his children. But this was being ripped away from her. Dan wasn't even letting Betty see the children who were living with him full time. Betty visited one day when she knew Dan was gone, and she saw a custard cake on the counter. She asked the kids, "Where did this cake come from?" And they answered, "Dad's friend Linda brought it over when she was here." Betty couldn't take it. She realized Linda was playing a big role in Dan's life and the life of her children.
I didn't know Linda was in my house and sleeping in my house and meeting my kids and stuff. I said, "Oh, is that so? Linda made the cake." So I took it upstairs and smushed it all over his bed just to be a...
And it got worse. When Betty would call Dan's house to speak to her kids, it was Linda's voice on the answering machine with a cheerful greeting to leave a message. Oh, and Betty did. She left vulgar, obscene messages using bad words. She didn't care that her kids could hear it. Betty couldn't help herself. Dan kept the recordings to use against Betty in the future.
What's this? We can't come to the phone. You're not supposed to come to the phone at the house. You're supposed to at the house, answer the phone at the office.
Dan was giving Betty $9,000 a month for expenses, but every time Betty left an obscene message or came over uninvited, Betty is fined and money is deducted from that check. One month, Betty actually owed Dan money. It got so bad. I'm not sure if she was expected to pay it or not. But when she found out she owed Dan money, she drove to his house to talk to Dan. She was arrested and spent the night in jail. But Betty didn't stop. She drove her car over his landscaping. Dan obtained a restraining order against Betty to keep her away. But the kids were being punished here too. They loved their mother, and what was happening was traumatic for them. The boys especially wanted to be with their mother. The two girls were much older at this point and could go back and forth between Dan and Betty's house if they wanted. Betty had always had the right snacks for the boys and the right food, and the boys said there was never anything good to eat at their dad's house. Betty knew she needed a good lawyer, but that was going to be a tough find. Dan was powerful in San Diego, and he was even head of the Bar Association. Who wanted to go up against Dan Broderick? Betty tried to move on. She even dated a younger guy named Brad Wright, and he was very sweet to Betty, but Betty could not get over Dan's rejection, especially after all the hard work she put into the marriage. She felt that she was removed from the picture in Dan's life and replaced by Linda Kolkena. It drove Betty crazy in a whole new way. Can you see what's happening here? Betty is going to blow. Dan also wanted to sell the family home they once shared. It's the only property that Betty had her name on the title. Dan got a court order to sell it for much less than Betty thought it was worth. What did Betty do? She got into her car and drove to Dan's house to confront him. He said, "Leave now, or I'll call the police." He even did a countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7. Betty did get in her car, but she proceeded to drive her car right into Dan's front door. Police came and put Betty in a straitjacket. Dan had her committed for 3 days to a mental hospital. Betty spoke to a therapist who later actually warned Dan that Betty is a very angry woman who is a threat to Dan's life. Betty said her life had been destroyed and Dan Broderick will not get away with it. He will die first. And someone is turning the knife in Betty's chest. She begins to receive ads in the mail for wrinkle cream and weight loss, and even a picture of Dan and Linda socializing with a message written underneath the picture saying, "Eat your heart out." The divorce was finalized with Betty receiving practically no assets at all. She did get $16,000 a month in alimony, which Betty thought was a drop in the Dan Broderick bucket, a bucket she worked hard to fill by working to pay his tuition through law school and medical school, on top of raising 4 kids. In 1989, Dan announces he and Linda will be getting married in a grand social affair. Betty goes out and buys a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson and takes shooting lessons. In April of 1989, Dan gets married. His friends beg him to wear a bulletproof vest, but he refused, and the wedding went off without a hitch. In November of 1989, Betty received a letter in the mail that threw her over the edge. It said she was in contempt of court for something, and she may go back to jail. Betty was going to get to the bottom of it this time. She would go over to Dan's house to talk, and she was going to take that Smith & Wesson with her. That way, he'll be forced to listen, and he won't be able to call the police. All she wanted to do was talk, or she was going to off herself right in front of him. Betty took her daughter's keys and drove to Dan's house. In the middle of the night, she let herself in and went upstairs to the bedroom. 5 shots went off. Linda was hit in the back and the head, and Dan was hit in the chest, and 2 bullets went into the wall. Betty said Dan sat straight up in bed and said, "Okay, you shot me, I'm dead." He reached for the phone, but Betty ripped the cord out of the wall. Dan and Linda were dead, and Betty turned herself in. That night in jail, Betty said she slept peacefully for the first time in years. Betty's defense lawyer was Jack Early, who would say Betty was an abused woman who was drove insane by Dan Broderick over a period of years. The prosecutor was Carrie Wells, who argued that Betty knew what she was doing all along when she took that weapon to Dan and Linda's house. The trial started in October of 1990 with Court TV providing gavel-to-gavel coverage, and America was fascinated. Betty's own daughters took the stand against her, saying Betty told them, "You know I had to do it. One of us had to die." Betty took the stand in her own defense, saying she only went to Dan's house to talk, and when someone said, "Call the police," the gun went off. Prosecutor Wells cross-examined Betty, saying, "The gun was not an automatic and not easy to fire, so Betty knowingly pulled that trigger 5 times. It couldn't just go off." Betty went there with the intent to kill. The prosecution also played a message from Dan's answering machine between Betty and her young son.
The best family in the whole world. We were all so happy. All the kids and me were so happy.
I know, well, we're going to be a lot happier if you just stop saying bad words.
Well, you tell that slime ball.
See what I mean, Mom? You're saying it right now. You better stop.
The media would go on to call these messages the best of Betty. It's just a sad situation. The trial was hung. 10 jurors voted for second-degree murder, and 2 held out for manslaughter. So on October 15th of 1991, Betty was tried again. Her daughters were called again, and Betty took the stand again in her own defense. At one point, Betty said, "I wish Dan was here to clear this all up." Carrie Wells said, "So do I." It was a stunning moment in the trial. This time, Betty was found guilty and given 32 years to life. Betty settled into prison pretty well and even said she began to feel like a normal person again. She even counseled other women about abuse. A lot of books and media are out there on Betty Broderick. A TV movie called A Woman Scorned and Her Final Fury did very well in the ratings. And Dirty John also covered Betty's life story. Betty hated them both because she said they made her look bad. I've read a couple books about Betty. Until the 12th of Never by Bella Stampo was really good. It details everything about the case. It's quite gripping. I also read Forsaking All Others by Loretta Schwartz Noble, and this is a good one too. It even has a prison interview with Betty Broderick, telling her side of the story in Betty's own words about her life with Dan, the affair, and the trials. Will Betty ever get out of jail? I don't know. It's been so long now. She was up for parole in 2017, but denied for 15 more years. Betty's problem? She never shows one iota of remorse. She says she is a victim here as well, and she'd rather be in prison than in the state of complete misery she was in before. Her kids do go visit her now and then. One of the boys said, though, that in letters she's written to them, she still rants about Dan.
I just want to say to her, you've killed them. Isn't that enough? Can you stop bashing them in their graves?
So why does this case fascinate me? I think it's because Betty has had so many supporters through the years. She gets lots of sympathy, especially from women, with one woman commenting, "What took her so long?" Some women relate who have been left for younger women. So did Betty really go over to Dan's house to talk that night in November 1989? Or did she go there with the intent to kill? I think Betty went there with the intent to kill. What do you think about the Betty Broderick case? Do you think it's time for her to get out of jail? Do you see any sympathy for her whatsoever? Let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. I appreciate you watching. Like and subscribe and turn on those notifications. And I'll be talking to you again soon. Bye.